Hello and welcome back to the State of Politics. We are joined today by Glasgow City Council's Deputy Leader, the convener of the Culture and International Cooperation Committee and the Chair of Glasgow Life, David McDonald. David, thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
Pleasure, yeah, great to be here. And thanks for the opportunity to be able to speak about some of these really important issues in the city.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on. It's a city, obviously, I live in, Patrick. It's a city he inhabits quite a lot. He just stays out in Lanarkshire, so he's in Glasgow quite a lot because there's not too much going on out there in sunny Uddingston. Patrick, do you want to kick us off with your usual re-roll into politics?
Yeah, you're a councillor now, deputy leader of Glasgow City Council, obviously, but just to sort of go back to the beginning, when did you get into politics? Why was it the SNP you decided to join? Is that the only party you've ever been a member of, and why do you support independence?
Yeah, so this is almost like ancient history now, for particularly for you two, who's been so young. There was once upon a time I was quite young myself, and when I was at school, high school in McDonald, we had a really engaging modern studies teacher, and at that point, this is kind of the late 90s, there was a lot of conversations taking place about the referendum to establish the Scottish Parliament and also the elections to the first Scottish Parliament. So there's a real interest in politics in my school because of the enthusiasm of this teacher, the same teacher and the same school, in fact, that Tommy Sheridan went to and that Mary Black went to. So I think you can see from that school, there was a real enthusiasm for their pupils to get involved in the life of the local community. And for me, that was kind of my route into politics, was just the idea of being an active participant in the school community. My family weren't political at all. Nobody was a member of a political party, but they were very active in sort of social justice type organisations, particularly my granddad, who was in a lot of organisations related to his church and would be regularly helping people in poverty across the local community. And so I think it was a combination of that interest in politics at school and a very small p political activism that was taking place in my own family that kind of led me to having a real interest in politics. And the SNP that I joined is an entirely different political party than the one we have today. So it was very unusual for a young person then to join the SNP, and I went along to my first branch meeting, and I think must have been the youngest person by at least 60 years. And I think they were all just so pleased that there was a young person had joined. So that was in 1999. And they were really keen that I went out to join them doing their campaigning. It turned out that they were really keen for me to do it because it meant I could do all the high stories in flats, and I could be sent up lampposts to tie SNP posters to the top of lampposts. So there was definitely a sense then that the SNP was a very different political force. And I think the reason that I wanted to join was just that sense of kind of a cultural awakening and a sense of Scottishness that was happening at that time in the late 90s with the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. And I just couldn't bring myself to kind of go and do the obvious thing from somebody from a working class background, would have been to go and join the Labour Party, but just that real resistance that they had to Scotland's sense of nationhood at that point for me was probably the big deciding factor. But then very quickly there was also other issues taking place in Glasgow at that point around the beginning of dawn raids on asylum seekers, and Labour at that point were doing nothing to help people, and so some of my own classmates at schools and others would suddenly vanish overnight. And so those issues all kind of came together, and that for me was the point where I said, well, I'd like to have some sort of role in politics. Never quite thought that would turn into an elected role in politics, but just a strange series of events have led me from that decision as a teenager at school to having the great privilege of serving the city that I love.
You spoke about the establishment of the Scottish Parliament there in the late 90s has been something that sparked your interest in politics. For me and Patrick, for our generation, that was probably the referendum in 2014, and there was obviously a lot of noise made about another referendum or major political events, but I think probably be agreement, and here feel free to disagree, but events like this do spark interest in politics, and I think they're healthy for society because it brings about obviously different viewpoints, different experiences, and as a collective, it's a collective idea. It's people that want the best for their country, and in a referendum, whether you're on the side of yes or no, it allows an argument and a debate to take place. It just wouldn't take place in terms of a normal election.
Yeah, I think that 2014, I think, just changed so much for people about what politics actually meant, because for so many people pre-2014, politics was just something that happened on the TV, and it was something you voted every couple of years if you could be bothered to vote. But suddenly 2014 became much more of a conversation with people directly, and it was less in the hands of politicians and political parties, and it was more around social movements and community groups forming organically. So I helped to run the campaign here in Pollock in Glasgow, which recorded the largest yes vote in Glasgow. But it was an amazing moment because I'd spent 10 years campaigning in places like Priest Hill and Nitz Hill, where you would get the door slammed in your face if you wanted to talk about politics, because it just wasn't relevant to people's everyday lives and experiences and the kind of struggles that people were going through. But suddenly we were going into those same communities and people were coming out of their house to come and speak to us. And there was just a sense of something really different happening in those communities. And I've never seen anything like that before or since. And the amount of people who had just completely switched off from politics pre-2014 in those same communities were the people who registered to vote for the first time in decades, or in some cases in people's lifetimes. And it's been important to try and harness all of that energy, not purely because of the constitutional issues, but because if you can get those people to be as interested in their own communities, those are the same people that have gone on since 2014 to form community councils, to get involved in food banks, and during COVID they were the first people out volunteering to support community resilience efforts. So that process of people becoming more engaged in their local community has continued here in Pollock, and I think it's continued across Glasgow and Scotland as well, and that can only be a good thing for our civil life and our civil discourse, regardless of the political impact. So that's why when people talk about having another referendum, and some people trying to paint that out to be something that would be negative, and that you hear these kind of stories a lot about how communities were set against each other during 2014, and I didn't really see anything like that. Of course, people passionately can disagree, but as long as people are doing it in a civil way, and people are putting across strongly held viewpoints, then that can only be a good thing. And we take the time to listen and to learn to other people, and to do some gentle persuasion along the way.
You were saying there, excuse me, that you joined the SNP, became involved in politics around 1999 when Blair first came to power, and then you're saying that dawn raids were starting, under Labour governments, and during the devolution sort of era, you weren't seeing that sort of Scottish, I think you said nationhood, or sort of pride in a Scottish identity. Despite all these Scottish characters being so integral to New Labour, you didn't see that in their policies and what they were saying. And then jump ahead to the referendum, you're saying that, places like Nitz Hill, Pollock, you're having the door slammed in your face, but all of a sudden, when it came to independence, these people took a great interest. They saw it as a sort of way out of this, either Tory or Blair sort of option that we've got in the UK. Do you think that because of what Labour has sort of become with, Blair, and then Keir Starmer's trying to basically remake that in order to win elections, that people from working class backgrounds are sort of attracted to the SNP and attracted to independence because they think it's their best shot at, sort of having a better life? And how important do you think sort of class and differences in income and deprivation levels. Edinburgh voted 60% no, Glasgow voted 53% yes. How important do you think that is to the independence debate?
Yeah, I think there's always a class dimension to any discussion, and I think those who deny that exists probably come from a higher class where they don't maybe come into contact with the rest of us. And I think you can see that just now with Boris Johnson's whole approach to COVID and everything else that's been happening, and the fact that he's off on his holidays at the moment. But I think the other problem that we've got in UK politics is there isn't enough distance between the political parties. So if you're looking at the big three UK political parties, if we still qualify, if the Lib Dem still qualify as being part of a big three, I don't know. But there's very little distance between them in terms of their political ideologies now. Certainly not the same sort of distance you would have seen in the 1930s to the 1960s. They've become so merged into the centre ground and to the centre right of politics that I think for people whose daily experience involves struggling and thinking about how they're going to pay their next fuel bill as they see prices skyrocket, or who rely on the £20 uplift that they had through Universal Credit recently. When people see the kind of callousness of the decision making at a UK level and how it bears no relation to, I think, people's ordinary everyday lives in a city like Glasgow, then I think people do feel disenfranchised from that type of politics. And whether it's the SNP or the Greens or other parties of the left who we've seen come and go over the last 20 years in Scotland, I think people are always looking for alternatives, because in that alternative they get a presentation of hope for that kind of better future that they want to live in. And I think that's what the SNP have done really well to create that narrative for themselves as a party, but also to give people something to aspire to. And I suppose that's what old Labour values were about, was about aspiring to something better for yourself, but better for society at the same time. And I think a lot of that has been lost in Labour's transformation over the last sort of 3 decades.
We'll touch on Labour and Council shortly. I think what you said there about the SNP is that they push the boundaries of devolution and continue to push the boundaries of devolution, something that the Labour government, Labour coalitions for the first 8 years of the Scottish Parliament just didn't do. And I think that's why we've came to this point now where people see a presentation of a very different future, very different from what was being shaped in London for such a long period of time of the early years of the Scottish Parliament. Just isn't the case now in the very different governments in Edinburgh and London. But David, for you, why was it council that you decided to go into? Why not Holyrood or why not Westminster?
So I think that probably comes a bit from the background that I described earlier about that connection back into local communities. But my non-political life has also been shaped by working in communities. So my non-political background is in community education, with working with people in informal settings. So outside of the classroom, looking at education, maybe for adult learners or for people who've fallen out from school for a variety of reasons. So I've always felt really connected to grassroots and community work. And I've been asked several times about making the move to Holyrood, and it's something that I've no intention of ever doing, and in fact would never actually want to do, because I think we need more people with a real commitment to local government. Local government shouldn't be a stepping stone for people into parliamentary careers. I've been kind of very vocal about that in the past, because for me, it's the services that local government deliver that are the services that people rely on a day-to-day basis, whether it's education or social work, or community-based services that make communities better places to live. They are, for me, the kind of the bread and butter issues that make politics interesting. And I think we need to have a real conversation in Scotland, as well as the conversation around independence. We need to have a conversation about where we see local government and ensuring that it's got the parity of esteem that it needs. We are the most centralised country in Europe when it comes to local government, and I think we need to break some of those old structures down, the structures that were inherited from the old regional days are pretty much still there, and they need to be broken down as much as we possibly can. So we've kept some of these Tory structures in place, and I think we need to have a really serious conversation about that. But so that doesn't fully answer your question about why local government, but I think for me it was about having that chance to serve at a local level, and for the last 10 years serving in the community that I was brought up has meant more to me than any opportunity to go to Holyrood or anywhere else. So hopefully with the elections coming next year, more people will see the opportunity of serving their community as the reason why they should get involved in politics at a local level, and take the opportunity to put themselves forward for candidates and to stand and to try and make a difference locally.
Just talk about local government there, David. I'm wondering if you can give me an insight, because I think I have an understanding of this issue, but I don't feel as if I do. I think it was 3.5 weeks ago, there was 34 orange marches, anti-Catholic marches, whatever you want to call them. The vast majority of people don't like these marches. They're filled with hate and sectarianism and bigotry, and everyone always says, well, what are the government doing about it? What are the council doing about it? And I just thought it was a simple matter of the processions committee saying no. But I think your colleague, Rory Kelly, I think I've pronounced his name correctly there, was saying that they don't have the legislative power. I'm not sure if that's the council or the Scottish government. I was just wondering if you could sort of explain, what can the council do about this sort of stuff? Because if it was, another section of society, say trans people, Jewish people, LGBT community, what is the process there?
Yeah, so I think it's very clear that what we've been saying in Glasgow for some time is we need those additional powers, and we need the police in particular to help us with this process if the powers aren't going to come forward from Holyrood. I think there is a growing consensus across the city that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and that we can't continue to do nothing. And we've had an opportunity, I think, over the last few years to try and raise these issues with government. But so far, they've been reluctant, I think, to enter into the conversations about what needs to be done. So I think we need government to be clearer and given the powers and the instructions to local government to be able to take more actions. Because as the current situation basically means that the role of local government is to facilitate any organisation who wants to march across the city. So we had the pro-independence march, for example, at the weekend. We've had we will have the major march for COP taking place in November. So it's the city council's role, along with the police, to ensure that those marches can be facilitated, unless there is a particular notice given by the police about a public safety issues. And the police are the experts in the public safety legislation, so we've got to take their guidance. And so quite often the police will say that they can police anything. So if they come forward and say that they can police a particular march that's planned, or a series of marches that are planned for a particular day, then there's nothing within the current legislation that allows the council to go against that ruling, because then the council is opened up to court action. And we've seen the council being taken to court when there was a number of marches which, on the basis of the police advice previously following the incident at St Alphonsus with the assault on Canon White at that time, that the council were able to take action because the police guidance was very clear that there was a risk to the life of the community, I think is the phrase that comes through the legislation. So we are very clear as a council that we want the government to help and assist us to have more powers and more flexibility so that we can have a better ability to address the challenges that you've pointed out, Patrick. And I think we know that something needs to give in this process, and we need the government to help us with that.
Thanks for clearing that up, David. I think that explains it really well, because again, like Patrick, I was a bit unsure how the whole process worked, but
Yeah.
I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier on about, where we see local government and the actual power that local government holds. And you touched on earlier about old structures being in place, and that the oldest structure being in place when you think about Glasgow City Council is how long there was a Labour administration in charge of Glasgow City Council. And, for ordinary voters looking forward to next year to the council elections, the SNP has been in charge in Glasgow now for 5 years, it'll be next year. How difficult would you say, in your opinion, it's been to change, in terms of how long Labour were in charge for, how difficult is it to change the legacy, if you will, that Labour had in Glasgow in such a short space of time? Because a lot of voters will still see that, they'll still think that Glasgow is much the same as it was 4 or 5 years ago. But what would you say have been the major changes that the SNP administration has done compared to all those years of the Labour administration in Glasgow?
Yeah, so I think there was no way that all of the problems that we inherited were going to be solved within one term, because we were inheriting decades of challenging decisions, should we say. I'm trying to be polite now, but I think there was so many areas of the council that just needed modernisation, first of all. There was challenges around how the council was structured, how decisions were taken, the kind of the backroom nature of how decisions were taken and how the council was run. All the way through to really small, simple things like the day one when we went to our offices, and when the council leader went to our office, she found that there was no desk and there was no IT in the office. So you suddenly start to think to yourself, well, how was the last council leader doing any work? So there's been a different challenge almost every day since day one. And then we've also had the a series of events that none of us could have predicted, from physical firefighting with the fires on Sucky Hall Street, which caused major issues, to the sort of moments of real crisis in the city, whether it's the issues at the Park Hotel with the deaths around asylum seekers and refugees, and obviously more recently the challenges around COVID. All of those were challenges that have taken an inordinate amount of time out of the planning that we'd been doing to try and create the kind of Glasgow that we'd put forward in our manifesto and that people voted for in record numbers, to try and just improve and create a more democratic and open council. So from those first 100 days, we were very clear that's what we wanted to try and do. That would be our real legacy of this first term, was to just reconnect Glasgow to its citizens and to give more power and control back to people, because the elections back in 2017, one of the big messages was people just didn't feel any sense of connection to Glasgow City Council. They felt no ownership over it, and there's still a lot of work to do in that respect, but we need to continue that effort to make Glasgow a more democratic city, for people to understand how and why decisions are taken, and how and why we spend their money in particular ways. Along the way, we've also had to clear up a lot of mess that Labour left in terms of the equal pay issues with women and low-paid workers, and that's taken the vast majority of this whole council term to try and clear up. That was more than a decade of delays that Labour put in place, and a real reluctance to take any action or to listen to trade unions or the women themselves directly. So it takes time to get a culture change in an organisation as big as Glasgow City Council as well, where you've got tens of thousands of employees, you have people who've had who've gotten used to a particular way of working and making decisions, and having to turn all of that around has been a challenge as well. But I think there's no doubt that we've made progress in significant areas as well, where we've seen record levels of investment in our school estates and in support for younger Glaswegians to try and tackle some of the poverty-related attainment gap within the city. The rolling out of 1,143 hours of early years education, the rapid increase that we're making around school meals in Glasgow. Those are areas where I think we feel a huge amount of pride, because they had also been issues where Labour had really just been dragging their feet for years. And in the kind of areas that I'm responsible in, the kind of the global reputation of Glasgow has also probably never been stronger than it is now. And obviously with COP in about 3 weeks, that will just be the pinnacle of the work that we've been doing to reposition Glasgow globally, and for people to realise that Glasgow is Scotland's only truly global city, and the longer term impacts that reputational impact will have on Glasgow in terms of bringing in new investment and new jobs to the city will help to advance the wider social policies that we're also trying to implement to create a more inclusive economy within the city.
Just going back to, you were saying about the desks were all gone in your offices. I think it's quite bold of you to assume that Frank McGilp was doing any work at all as the leader of Glasgow City Council. Just, you're talking there also about the 2 fires in Sauchiehall Street. You've also seen, I think, was it the Old College Bar that went on fire a few months ago, and then Declan will correct me on this, the church in Partick, was it St Peter's or St Simon's?
St Simon's, yep. Jerry Hassan had dubbed it Tinderbox City or something, wasn't it, when we spoke to Jerry?
Is there some sort of, I don't even know what question I'm trying to ask here, but, is this quite a common occurrence in cities across the world? Do buildings like this go on fire when, they're so old? Is there something that we're doing wrong as a city in the past couple of years that, all these buildings keep burning down, and, what is the council sort of thinking about all this?
Yeah, so colleagues are looking at this as an area of investigation for us to figure out what more could we be doing as a city to try and put in more preventative measures. So quite often these aren't buildings that the council own. I think that's the first thing that we've got to be clear about. So there is a level of responsibility to the landlord to make sure that their building is properly secure and it meets the various legislations for buildings that are abandoned or derelict. So we are looking to try and tighten up some of the restrictions around that, because I think we all know that there's been too many mysterious cases in Glasgow over decades of buildings which were maybe in the way of developments, shall we say, that suddenly find themselves victim to these sorts of fires. So I think there does need to be a greater emphasis put on site owners and potential developers that if a building that is of real significance architecturally, but that gets destroyed in a fire, then maybe as a city we should be saying, well, you have to rebuild as is. You can't just then clear the site and build something new in its place. So I think there's a lot of discussions taking place across the city at the moment about what more we can do to try and stop this issue from happening. But it's something that has been taking place in Glasgow for decades and that no one yet has been able to find the solution for.
In terms of one of the other challenges that I think the council's faced, and it was something that was well documented online and on social media, particularly Twitter, was library closures and libraries closing just now. I know the library at the bottom of my street has been done up in St George's Cross here. I think it's been under development. What's the kind of update on that just now, David, in terms of libraries reopening or closing down? Because I know that's not just a Scotland-based issue, it is happening across the UK, but as the chair of Glasgow Life, what is kind of the council's position on libraries just now? Because as we all know, they're very important buildings that I'm sure we've all used to a very good extent in our lives.
Absolutely. So we've very clear policy that we want to have all of our libraries reopen as soon as we have the finances for that to happen. Glasgow Life have a really ambitious project that protects libraries. So we're one of the few local authorities anywhere across the UK that hasn't seen large-scale library closures. I think there's been something like 800 libraries across the UK that have closed in the last decade. And none of those in Glasgow, and none of them will be in Glasgow if we can get our finances sorted out. So the challenge that we face in Glasgow is fairly unique because we have such a massive cultural organisation in the form of Glasgow Life that has been really successful in driving forward its income, mainly through sports. So anybody who's a member of the Glasgow Club, for example, or who buys a ticket to go to the concert hall, we take that money and we reinvest it in services like libraries, so that we have been able to avoid the kind of cuts that other local authorities have seen. But when COVID came along, that income stream was entirely switched off overnight. That was £38 million of income that was lost and that we didn't have an ability to recoup at that point. All of our facilities, not just libraries, but every Glasgow Life facility was then closed on the government's orders as part of the COVID restrictions that came in place. And what we now have is a reopening programme. So we have 5 of our libraries which are still closed, but that we want to get open. Some of them are closed because they're currently vaccination centres, so they will remain vaccination centres for as long as they're required. Some are currently closed because they also need some major capital investment in order to reopen them in the way that we would like. But we do need to have that additional resource again from government to help us to recoup that lost income from COVID. And I have been kind of making this case on a regular basis well before COVID came along, from 2017 when I took this role on at Glasgow Life, trying to make the very clear case that Glasgow is unique in Scotland, that we need more national funding to come into our cultural venues, for example, our museums, where we have the largest museums collection, civic museums collection anywhere in the UK outside of London, one of the largest in Europe. But it's entirely funded by Glasgow taxpayers. We have a £12 million budget for 9 city museums. We get 4 million visitors for that. We also then all contribute as taxpayers in Scotland to the national museums, which are primarily but not exclusively based in Edinburgh, who have a budget of about £22 million, and they get 2 million less visitors than we do in Glasgow. So we're either in a situation where Glasgow museums are extremely well managed and efficient in how we spend our money, or perhaps there's too much funding going into national museums and not enough return coming back. So I've been making the case regularly that Glasgow needs to have its fair share of culture funding at a national level, and that will help us to get more of our museums and cultural venues open, and then that means we can use that money to get the other libraries open as quickly as we possibly can.
Obviously, you said there was that big gap lost in terms of finances there. £38 million is a large chunk to come out the budget. But one thing a lot of Glaswegians have seen over the past 18 months, so it's had a mixed reaction, certainly as you'll probably know, is Glasgow being reshaped as an active travel hub. I think there's a lot of bike lanes appeared in the city. I think what I read was another 270 kilometres of cycleways and pathways to be introduced into the city. In terms of your opinion on these and the bike lanes, there's a lot of people with cars not happy about this. What would you say is the benefits of this in terms of, is it just reconnecting the city and making things a lot easier for people to get about the place and trying to bring about more active travel in terms of, we're going to get on to COP, but in terms of looking at how we slash emissions and, start to be a wee bit greener. Is stuff like this, the very, at the bottom of in terms of a structural perspective, is stuff like this essential to be introduced to create that type of environment?
Yeah, so amongst my colleagues within the city government, I've had this reputation as being one of the few petrol heads within our group. And pre-COVID was somebody that probably only really travelled by car. So I understand the kind of the frustration that people express about these issues, but I've also taken the chance over the last 2 years to kind of assess my own thoughts on these issues. And suddenly came to the realization that the reason I had tended to travel by car is because there is no public transport network where I live in Pollock. It's impossible for me most days to get into town and back out of town and go to community meetings and then go back into the city chambers and to get around the city in the way that I needed to. And there was no safe cycling infrastructure. And it's only when you really, I think, start to understand that the policy that we're trying to implement in Glasgow is around turning that hierarchy of travel upside down and to have cars at the bottom, because they've been at the top for decades in Glasgow, and we have been a car orientated city rather than a people orientated city. So I think the work that we've been doing, that my colleague Anna Richardson has been leading, has again helped to transform the city in such a positive way, and it's going to take time for people to, I think, fully appreciate or use to the fullest extent the new bike lanes that have been going in across the city. But we can't fail to act. We know that the climate issues and the emissions targets that the city have to be a net zero city by 2030 mean that we need to take this sort of radical action. But we also, I think, should be starting to look more at the kind of social and the health and the well-being aspects of people like me getting out of their car and being prepared to get on a bike more often, or to walk more often, and to find these new ways of commuting around their neighbourhood. It's certainly been kind of life-changing during the lockdown period for me, and I'm starting to see very slowly but gradually in the bike lanes that have been installed in Pollock, where there has been a lot of complaints, and we are starting to now see people realise that they can sit and wait now for 20 or 30 minutes in some of the queues that are forming because they've lost some of those lanes, whereas they are seeing the cyclists zoom past them and get home much quicker. So I think it will take time. It's the lesson from many other cities across the globe who've gone through this process, that it does take 5-10 years for people to really see the benefit, but you've got to be brave at the start and take those decisions. The funding that we've utilised from that has been national funding, and having made the case so strongly for national funding for so long, we couldn't then turn around to the government and say thanks, but no thanks, spend that money somewhere else. So hopefully the longer term, and when we look back at this in 5 or 10 years, we'll realise that it was the right thing to do, and to use this as a moment to kind of change behaviour and to play a small part in the much wider work that's ongoing in the city to try and meet that 2030 target about being a net zero city.
So you probably agree it's going to be a long-term goal, a payoff, and that, for the first couple of years you will have teething, you will have the complaints, but you think that over time, we might see that transition of more people using active travel or walking to work instead of taking the car as they usually would, or even jumping in public transport to avoid those long queues. Obviously, the Glasgow City Council doesn't have a budget that can spend money and throw money at anything. But something that's been brought up, something that the leader of the council was scrutinised on, was the litter problem within Glasgow. And so there was the idea to pick target areas for fly tipping hotspot areas to target them. How would you say the city responds to this? Because litter, it's a problem that every city faces, but a lot of people are saying that when they go into the city centre, no, after COVID, the place is looking a bit tatty, a bit run down. How does the city solve this issue at this point in time, which will lead us on to COP for welcoming a lot of delegates and a lot of attention on the city in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, so I think it's a bit like the situation that we were discussing about Glasgow Life, where decisions had to be taken that were out of the ordinary, and I think that was the same for cleansing services, where the decision was taken to prioritise household collections during COVID. I think understandably, because most high streets and cities, the city centre, for example, there wasn't much in the way of business being open in those locations. So the impact that we now have is that we are trying to catch up with almost 2 years of those services not operating at their usual level. And I think people understand that that was always going to take time to catch up, and that there are challenges across the city. I don't think anyone has ever denied that those challenges have taken place. I think there's been political opportunism at play in the city, where people have tried to pretend that in some way that Glasgow was different from any other major city across the UK or indeed internationally. So we know from the actual data that is produced and that's reported to the various government departments who look at waste strategy, that the same issues that exist in Glasgow also exist in Birmingham or in Liverpool or Manchester. And so Glasgow isn't unique in these respects. What perhaps is unique in Glasgow is that we had already quite a poor record over things like recycling in tenemental properties. So we not only have to catch up, but we're starting from a base that's further back. So there's huge amounts of investment that were planned pre-COP, which are now starting to come online, where we have new resources. We've got now the world's largest fleet of hydrogen refuge collection vehicles that will be hitting the streets shortly. We have the local initiatives that's going to be led by our local neighbourhood officers, who are going to be going out and being the kind of main troubleshooters in local areas to find out where the fly tipping hotspots might be. And we're also then having to take much clearer action to say that the challenge around fly tipping tends to be commercial waste more than anything else. So there's a responsibility on those business owners who are choosing to dump their rubbish in public places rather than do the responsible thing, which is for them to go and to arrange for that to be collected and to have a contract in place. So we now have enforcement officers going out and ensuring that those contracts are in place, and that will hopefully get us on top of the major issue of fly tipping that people see in their local high streets, which by far and away is related to that issue around commercial waste.
Patrick's made his return. Did you hear everything we were chatting about there?
I heard the vast majority of it, yes.
Yep.
The rubbish collection waste strategies in Birmingham, and yes.
Yep. About libraries too.
There we go. I actually only found out the other day that there's a sort of plan sort of slowly developing for a metro system, I believe it is, that's going to be sort of connecting different parts of the city together. And I think the picture on Glasgow Live is like, it was like above ground as opposed to the subway, which is below ground. And you know, there's been calls from people like Paul Sweeney to extend the Glasgow subway. Is this a way of doing it that, you know, would be more efficient, you know, energy-wise, environmental-wise, easier, you know, infrastructure-wise, to sort of get that connectivity between places? I think Declan mentioned the extension of the cycle paths all around the city. Is this something that, you know, just to improve the connectivity, is it easier?
Yeah, so I think it was 2018 we launched the Glasgow Connectivity Commission, which was an independent group that was set up, bringing transport experts together with engineers, with consultants, with council, with Transport Scotland and others. And they've been looking at a number of issues about how we improve connectivity across Glasgow. And the Metro proposals, which is for the Glasgow city region, it's not just for the city, but it's for the 8 local authorities that make up the city region, is around that major generational transport infrastructure project that can really just connect the whole of the city region in a brand new way. So there's a great amount of information about the Metro that's online, but the Metro itself really stands out as being the big ask that we are putting together in what we're calling the Glasgow's Green Print for investment, which is one of the things that we're going to be highlighting during COP. There's a multi-billion pounds opportunity for investors, both public and private investors, to be investing in Glasgow. The Metro is one of those, but so too is the retrofit programme that we want to bring to the housing stock across Glasgow to make them more energy efficient. Looking to create district heating systems to help cut people's bills, but at the same time tackle issues with emissions. Projects like putting a cap on the M8 at near the Charing Cross junction. So all of those are going to be part of what the city are trying to sell to investors during COP, and hopefully we'll see record amounts of inward investment coming into Glasgow to help make projects like the Metro a reality, and help us to kind of move on from the decades of conversation we've been having about a properly connected city and all of the plans that people keep creating that never have any funding behind them. This is about putting both a plan of action and a plan of funders together and using COP as that pivotal moment for Glasgow.
When you use the word investor, David, obviously, when it comes to investor, they're looking for sort of return on their money. They're looking to make money, make capital. If it transpired to be a bad investment and there's to say, a couple of big investors pulled out, could that throw a spanner in the works for things like the Metro and the M8, as you were saying?
So what we're hoping is that the Metro, for example, can be a project that the council and the other regional councils across the Glasgow City region and the Scottish Government, taking their collective investment power, can really ensure that the Metro happens regardless of any private investment that we can bring in. So Transport Scotland have included the Metro in their most recent transport strategy plan as being one of the major infrastructure projects that the Scottish Government want to support, in the same way that in recent years something like the Queensferry Crossing, for example, that was funded by the Scottish Government as a transport initiative. We hope that this could be the next big project that the government throw their weight behind, so that we're not reliant on any one individual private funder, but there will be in that Green Print programme opportunities for private investment across the city, because there's a huge number of projects. It's well worth taking the chance of going on the Invest Glasgow website and reading the prospectus and then sharing it widely, because there's so much. It's about £30 billion worth of spend that's contained within that Green Print. And again, it's about trying to utilise the opportunity of having some of the world's largest renewable technology investors come into Glasgow in 3 weeks' time to try and sell the city and to sell opportunities for improving the city to make it greener and more sustainable to those people who want to spend money on these types of projects.
In terms of COP, you've outlined a lot of the positives that COP is going to bring to Glasgow, but for a lot of ordinary citizens, they'll see the daily life disrupted by motorway closures, etc. What would be your message to majority Glaswegians that are going to be affected in some way by COP26 in a few weeks' time, because it's going to change the outlook and the way of the city for a few weeks' time. What would be your message to majority of kind of ordinary citizens in the city that need to commute and are going to find that their journey time or whatever else is going to be disrupted?
Yeah, so obviously we're keen to minimise that disruption as much as possible. And all of the information and alternative routes are all published on the Get Ready Glasgow website. For anyone that needs that information, it is all there. I think over the kind of the last 10 years or so, we've also become used to having major events in Glasgow, whether it was Commonwealth Games or the European Championships or the UEFA events in the summer. But this is unlike anything we've ever seen before. It's the largest event that the UK has ever held. A big proportion of the city is about to become UN territory and no longer Glasgow City Council territory. And we're having up to 200 world leaders, which obviously comes with a certain amount of security precautions that are unfortunately unavoidable. So we would ask people to go and check the website, get to know what potential routes that they use are going to be affected, and to plan accordingly. But we are making sure that the city can continue to operate as best as it possibly can during COP. But we also want people in Glasgow to feel part of COP themselves. So there are going to be a lot of events that people, the ordinary Glaswegians, can attend, both within the official site, so within the green zone of COP. I think tickets for that can be booked from today. Where if there are particular sessions that you want to go to, or talks or lectures or events that are taking place, that any ordinary citizen has the opportunity to be part of that conversation. And there will also be events taking place in other communities across the city, because it's always been important to us that COP wasn't just something that took place in Glasgow, but it was something that was shaped by Glasgow and shaped by the values of the city, and that people had the opportunity to take part in this sort of once in a lifetime moment. And to make sure that Glasgow's name kind of does ring out from COP is something that we've always wanted to ensure. So we want very much for there to be a Glasgow agreement, and for that to be the moment where the world really takes notice and takes proper actions to address the climate crisis that we're all facing. So it will be challenging. There's no getting away from that for ordinary people going about the business, but also there will be, I think, great opportunities, and the city will just, I think, be so full of life and character and colour, and people from across the planet coming here. I think it will be a moment that will probably live in everyone's memory for the rest of their lives. So hopefully those few days of maybe congestion or delays will be worth it in the long term if it does secure that more prosperous future for the planet.
You're saying there about COP, it's going to sort of definitely bring Glasgow onto the world stage more than anything else, and how you're sort of, as deputy leader, involved in that sort of that process of enhancing Glasgow's image to the world. I read somewhere that you were sort of responsible for bringing the Euros to Glasgow for Euro 2020. I'm not sure how involved in that you were, but it certainly gave you the credit for it. How gutted were you when COVID effectively spoiled that, and you couldn't have fans in the ground, and you couldn't really have fans coming from other countries to properly have a proper European Championships with 3 or 4 games in Glasgow?
And a headache with fan zones, because the planning for that, you attended the fan zone, Patrick, and that must have been really difficult as well, because obviously you must have just planned for like an normal big open space Glasgow, getting everybody in for a party, then you've had to introduce testing and different precautions, and obviously relation with guidance.
Yeah, well, it's very kind, Patrick, to give me the credit, and like any politician, I'll gladly accept it. But it was.
He might blame you for the 2 defeats at home, though, David. Is the only thing.
It was an interesting project to be involved in, and I was involved from the very conception all the way through to the matches taking place in the fan zone. So 2013, I think we kind of got wind that UEFA were looking at doing something different for 2020, which was the 60th anniversary of the first Euros. And they'd come up, it was Michel Platini came up with this plan of doing a Euros across Europe. And I had put forward a motion to the City Council to say that Glasgow should put forward a bid, which got cross-party support in 2013. So from that moment, when I was still in opposition at that point, so can't really claim all of the credit, because it did have to then go through the administration, and mainly then to the officers within Glasgow Life, who did an incredible job in pulling the bid together. But when the 2017 elections then took place, I found myself as part of the local organising committee, and just seeing how an organisation like UEFA and the SFA and others work on these major projects was a bit of an eye-opener as somebody who's just a football fan in general, but then being on the inside of that whole world of international football was quite eye-opening. The impact of COVID on that event, though, I think really was kind of heartbreaking for all of us, particularly once Scotland had qualified, because we knew that it wasn't going to be the same. And it was great that fans were in Hampden, but a full Hampden, like we seen the other day against Israel, I think would have just given the team that little bit more encouragement, and hopefully would have helped to have made a bit of a difference. So it was really a kind of heartbreaking moment that we couldn't do all the plans that we wanted to, but we were able to rescue as much of it as we possibly could. The original plan for the fan zone was actually in George Square and the Merchant City, so there was going to be two fan zones, but there wasn't enough space there for them when we got the go-ahead to allow the fan zones to happen with social distancing. So we made the best of a really challenging situation, and I think it gave the city and Scotland the moment that it needed, kind of coming out of lockdown. I think we all needed that moment of coming together. So when I spoke at the very start about that kind of sense of nationhood and feeling that sense of connection, I think the Euros kind of gave us all that, and it gave us something to be cheerful about for the odd 90 minutes until the reality of being a Scotland fan kind of kicked in. So it was a great moment just to be part of something on that scale, and again for Glasgow to be part of it. And when you look at this, the other global cities that are hosting these types of events, it speaks volume to the great work that goes on by staff in Glasgow Life and in sports organisations across the city that allows Glasgow to be officially in the top 5 of the world's best sporting cities. So we're up there against London and New York and Tokyo and Paris and Glasgow as the top 5 sporting cities in the world. So we're doing pretty well, punching above our weight when it comes to those cities. And long may that continue, because it provides a huge economic return for the city to be hosting events like that, but it does also just enhance living in the city in a whole new way.
It would be nice one day that Glasgow actually has the complete control of one of those events. It'd be great to see once, because I think we always do eventually well. I think what we did the Commonwealth Games to really high standard. There was a real good buzz about the place in 2014, if I remember right, and even then, as you say, under COVID restrictions, there was still a great buzz about Glasgow. If you walked about the city centre and whatnot, it did help that Scotland was there as one of the competing nations. But I think it lifts the mood, and as you say, out of COVID, it certainly lifted everybody's mood. You touched on George Square there, David, just to kind of conclude. We saw George Square and a lot of the area around the city centre now pedestrianised. Both myself and Patrick got university just around the corner from where you work in the city centre. In terms of that, Glasgow, again, is not one of the only cities in Europe making its city centre more pedestrianised. How important to that for you in terms of the economy going forward? Is it going to be to, I know a lot of people are saying Glasgow was kind of al fresco to be going forward. Obviously, we don't always get the nicest of weather for it, but is it a different approach and a better approach that we can take? And just kind of finally on that, to link it with taxis, there was a news report last week that I watched that was saying that there isn't as much taxi drivers in the streets of Glasgow just now, and it's one of the things that's worrying a lot of young females that are in late shifts, and their employer isn't really doing their bit in terms of paying for their fare or whatever else. But if they were, there's still a shortage of taxis. How we can try and get taxi drivers back in the streets, because I think there is a shortage. I've noticed it myself. So just on pedestrianisation in Glasgow city centre and taxis.
Yeah, so just maybe on taxis first, I think there's a number of issues that are impacting the taxi trade as a whole. Obviously, the impacts of lockdown continue, and that people maybe had to find other routes of employment because of the lack of passengers that were moving around the city at that point. The issues that we've seen well documented around fuel costs, which make it more expensive to run a taxi, and I think the added complication around wider lack of drivers in all routes, whether that's truck drivers, bus drivers, or indeed taxi drivers. I think there is a wider Brexit impact that maybe isn't coming to the fore. So certainly, I think if there's anything the city can do, our colleagues that sit in the licensing committee who oversee taxi regulations in the city are looking at these issues, and if there's anything that comes out of that work that the city can do, then we've already committed to try and do the best we can, because and in particular the issues that you raised, Declan, the importance of having that safe way home for people can't be underestimated. So if there is something that we can do, then we are open to look at that. And in the issue of George Square, I think I've been somebody who's been campaigning for a long time to try and have George Square properly returned as the real civic heart of the city. I think it's been a glorified roundabout for far too long, and I think we need to get to a consensus about what we do in George Square. Wasn't a fan of many of the plans that were put out into the public domain previously. But we have recently appointed a fantastic architectural firm, a Scottish architect, John McCaslin and Partners, to come up with a new vision for George Square. And he'll be doing that over the next few months and years. And then there'll be all of the usual public consultations. So everybody will have the opportunity to air their views about George Square. But I think we are now at a position where everyone accepts that it should be a fully pedestrianised area, or a majority pedestrianised area, and that it should fall into the kind of the mainstream of European squares and plazas, that we use it as a civic space, and that we try and keep it as a civic space and not a commercial space. I think that's important as well, and that it becomes the place that Glasgow comes to celebrate or to commemorate important moments. And yeah, I think once we get over the weather issues and the challenges, and we accept that we're not going to get many opportunities to sunbathe in George Square, I think we can just focus on how we make it a place that's inviting, that's safe, that people want to be in, and hopefully the plan that the architects put together in conversation with the public will result in a square that we can all be proud of.
Kelvin Way, to add to that, has also been a welcome addition to being pedestrianised. It's somewhere I walk about a lot. I went to school not that far from Kelvin Way, and I think it's just great, again, that you can, you don't need to have to worry about traffic and whatnot passing by. You can really, I think it expands Kelvin Grove Park as one whole park instead of having a 2.5 parks with a road running through the middle of it. So, yeah, I look forward to seeing what plans are coming up there. Patrick, have you got anything else to add?
No, just to sort of thank you for coming on. As you mentioned, there isn't the sort of national coverage that councils don't get the same national coverage as maybe the Scottish Parliament or Westminster might do. So thanks a lot for coming on and clearing stuff up and being very informative and answering all of our questions.
Yeah, it's been interesting to hear somebody who's been at the heart of decisions in Glasgow through COVID and as we go out of COVID to see what the plans are. And we really appreciate you giving us your time to come on and speak to us, David.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me. And hopefully you'll maybe think about having more councillors on to talk as we go through to the elections next year. I think it will help to raise the platform and realise that politics isn't always about the kind of the glitz and the glamour that you associate with parliamentarians. Sometimes it's also about the grit that happens at a grassroots level, and that's where the real difference can be made. So thanks, guys.
Absolutely. Yep. Thanks for joining us, David, on The State of Politics.